Hello everyone, and welcome to week 2 of English 213. This week, we're going to be reading our first piece of literature, Beowolf, which you'll find in your anthology from pages 36 to 108. You're going to be participating in a conversation about Beowolf, and then you're going to take some quizzes on in order to see how well you understand Beowolf. Remember, you can take those quizzes as many times as you'd like. So let's talk first about how I expect you to read in this class. To say it in one word is I want you to read actively. So that means I want you to have a pen in your hand when you're reading, and your text should look something like the text you see in this picture to the left. Before you read, you want to understand when the text was written, what kind of text it is, and who wrote it. And remember, you can find out all that information in your anthology. It's right before you begin reading. There's a small section about the author who wrote it, and in this case, the translator, right, who translated it. And it's important to know that. Also to know when this actually was written. So in the case of Beowolf, this is really important because this is certainly not the modern day. So please pay attention to this. While you're reading, I want you to ask questions. I want you to underline things that, any passages that you like, or star them, and then write down to yourself why you like it. Circle passages that you don't understand, and then go back to them to make sure you get them. Connect what you're reading to other texts that you've read. Maybe a section when they're in the Great Hall drinking mead reminds you of an episode of Vikings you once saw, right? Make that connection for yourself so you can connect it. Connect what you're reading to other texts as well. Maybe this reminds you of another text that you've read before. And then make sure that you understand what's going on by summarizing in your head what's happened, or writing down, what the parts are. Then much of what we're going to be reading in this class, I really want you to make time to read it, because it's going to be slow reading. I don't know how fast you read, but when I read something like epic poetry, I tend to take a little bit longer because I really want to absorb it and understand it. You're also going to want to be in a quiet environment. If at all possible, try to find a place where you can read for a couple hours each week so you can really keep up with our reading. If you have any questions about how to actively read, if there's anything I can do to help you, please come see me. I'm very happy to meet with you, or give me a call if you can't come on to campus. I'm happy to talk with you about strategies to really dig into this, because some of what we're going to be reading is very difficult. Alright, so let's talk about the word horde of medieval poetry. And you'll notice that the word horde is kind of a medieval poetry steal in order to describe it. It means like a great plentiful horde, a great plentiful pile of amazing words together. That's what medieval poetry is to me. It always consists of powerful storytelling. The fact that most medieval poetry comes from an oral tradition originally means that the people who wrote these poems knew how to tell a really good story, because they had to keep people's attention without something written down on a piece of paper. Often they're filled with riddling wit, political challenges, incantatory patterns of sound, surreal landscapes. Some of the places you're going to see in Beowolf are just the woods, the hoarfrost woods. They're stunning and scary, and there's piercing invasions of the supernatural throughout. I mean, there will be dragons roaming these lines, and it's an amazing poem. There's a big conflict that's going on in this poem, and also in other texts that are recovered from this time. And it's pagan versus Christian. So the Germanic people did not acquire the art of writing until after their conversion to Christianity. So our main source for this, any kind of record of this time, is Beatty's ecclesiastical history of the English people. And Bede was an English monk, and most who transcribed the poetry of the Germanic peoples were Christian. So this really deeply affected how they recorded the poems and the kind of frame they put around the pagan rituals and religion that were associated with the Germanic people. So much of our knowledge of pagan Germanic mythology and heroic literature is limited, and most of it comes from archaeology and from literature sources like Beowulf, when the pagan world of a distant past had already been filtered through the imagination of Christian authors. So the image to your left is the damaged text of Beowulf. There was actually parts of Beowulf actually don't exist anymore because there was a great fire that destroyed part of the manuscript in the 1800s. Beowulf is an example of an Old English epic. It's an oral tradition, and it ignores most classical conventions. You may have heard about other epics, including the Odyssey or the Iliad, the Aeneid. These were, and when you read these epics, there are names that often sound familiar to many of us because the Greek history, Greek mythology has filtered into our culture, whereas the Germanic history is not as it's not as common to us, and it's difficult for us to connect immediately with it. It takes a little more work to read an Old English epic. It's a large tradition of performed heroic legends. There's an example of someone performing a poem in Beowulf. It's when Skap is performing a poem in honor of Beowulf. It's a poem within the poem. It's like a frame poem, and he's telling a little story inside of Beowulf. And that's an example of a poet coming to the great hall of the people and performing a poem. And this was done commonly. Epic claims to be based on history, so it was a way for the Germanic people to remember their history. So you'll see in the beginning of Beowulf, there's this there's a list of the past and what happened before Beowulf was born, and that's important to pay attention to. It's something that you'd see in other poems. Beowulf was translated by Seamus Heaney, and Seamus Heaney, for those of you who don't know, is a famous, he was a famous Irish poet, won the Nobel Peace Prize. He was asked to translate Beowulf, which is no small matter, but he was asked to do so, and he did so because he felt a real connection to it. He's described it as, if you look inside of some of his poems, his most famous poem is called Digging, and you can see the alliterative verse, the inheritance of this alliterative verse, which means the repetition of vowels and consonants that paces his own writing, that he inherited from medieval epics like Beowulf. Beowulf is the oldest and finest example of the Germanic heroic literature. And the person who wrote it is not the person who probably originally composed it. The poet who wrote it down was not from the time that's being depicted in the poem. He was a Christian, so his filter of Christianity is coming through, and he was an antiquarian. That means he was trying to remember the past and record the past. Up until about the 1930s, Beowulf was taught really kind of as an artifact. It was like something that people had to suffer through as learning old, and they would read it in Old English, which is quite a different experience than reading it in a translation like the one that you guys get to read it in. But the person who actually changed that perspective was J.R.R. Tolkien, who you might know from, he wrote The Hobbit and many other amazing novels and very popular novels, which also contain some medieval images. Well, he was a famous medievalist critic, He studied at Oxford, taught at Oxford, and he wrote a paper called Beowolf, the Monsters and the Critics, that was published in 1936, that really looked at this as a piece of literature, that looked at its poetic value. And when you read it, I really want you to think about how it's not just telling you about olden times. It's a documentation of it's well crafted. There are beautiful poetic passages. There are things that we can relate to in the modern day that are occurring on the page that, even though this happened decades and decades and decades ago. So what's ironic about this, the earliest English epic, is that it was already an elegy for the epic values that are being, this idea of the heroic code that's being, talked about in this writing. I do want to bring your attention to the Sutton Hoo treasure. This is an example of, both in the beginning and the ending of Beowulf, you'll be at a funeral pyre where the way that they honored their dead was to burn them in their boat with all of their treasures, or they would bury them with all their treasures. And this Sutton Hoo was actually a great find where they found the burial site of one of the great leaders, of the Germanic leaders. And so there's examples of all of the, the helmets and the chainmail and everything that you see throughout, that you're going to see on the page throughout Beowulf. There's pictures of that, and I really think it helps you visualize if you look at those. So there's a link to look at that. I also have some pictures in here of some of the treasures, especially when you're thinking of the gold treasures that the dragon is hoarding. These are good images to think about. So just the overview. This is the genre. Again, Beowulf is heroic. It's a highly wrought literary epic. It's the story of a hero upon whose actions hang the fate of his people. So in the end, pay attention to what happens to Beowulf and then to his people after his demise. There is a strong belief in this piece about fate called Wyrd. Fate is what controls what happens to the people, and it's really important to pay attention to how fate is spoken about in the beginning versus the end of the piece. There's a lot of beautiful imagery and stark and haunting imagery throughout the text. Pay attention to light versus dark, so light imagery versus dark, or the made or the human crafted versus the wild, right? There's beautiful descriptions of the great halls where great leaders would gather with their people to eat and to be safe. They'd sleep there together, try to be safe, except when Grendel's in town. And Grendel, by the way, is the monster that will be again haunting them. There's amazing descriptions of gold treasures and arms, the uniforms that everyone is wearing, the helmets, the description of Grendel's arm that's severed, Asher's head. Pay attention to these. There's many amazing speech acts, like the formal boast, what Seamus Heaney calls the formal boast, when after being challenged by someone else, Beowulf exclaims what he's done, right? What he's done to achieve greatness. There's a lot of passages that you want to pay attention to. You'll need to read the entire thing, but Grendel's view of Heorot, which is found on lines 86 forward. Beowulf's speech to Hrothgar, imagining his death at Grendel's hands on line 442. The hall session, so the fight between Beowulf and Grendel, that's line 767. The found sword that melts, that's line 1605. The lament of the keeper of the hoard, that's 2247. The epic simile, and an epic simile is when you compare something to something else, but you keep going. Epic means big, right? You just keep comparing it to things. The epic simile for King Hrethel's misery, that's on 2444, 2444. The Corrupting Treasure, that's on 2754, and then Beowulf's Funeral, which is found on pages 3134. There's a lot of amazing passages that we can still relate to today. I want to bring your attention to one passage that when you're reading, it's towards the end, and it's about, it's after Beowulf has died. I know, I'm telling you, I'm ruining it for you. Beowulf is going to do great things, and then he will die. It's a hero's journey. No surprise there. But I want to read this passage to you, and I do want to say the best way to read this poem is to read it on the page, but also listen to Seamus Heaney reading it to you. There's audio files under this week's content. It will really help you understand it. So I'm going to read lines 3143 through 3155. This is what happened once they lit the funeral pyres for Beowulf. And pay attention to the Geat woman that comes in, and try to relate that to the idea of a whole people understanding what's going to happen to them when they've lost their leader, and who knows, their fate is uncertain. On a height they kindled the hugest of all. Funeral fires, fumes of wood smoke billowed darkly up. The blaze roared and drowned out their weeping. Wind died down, and flames wrought havoc in the hot bone house, burning it to the core. They were disconsolate, and wailed aloud for their lord's decease. A Geat woman, too, sang out in grief. With her hair bound up, she unburdened herself of her worst fears, a wild litany of nightmare and lament. Her nation invaded, enemies on the rampage, bodies in piles, slavery and abasement. Heaven swallowed the smoke. So it's a really striking image. This woman is wailing, right? She's singing these songs of grief, and meanwhile the heaven is swallowing the smoke from the fire. So pay attention to passages like that found throughout the text. The other thing I want you to pay attention to is the idea of a monster. We have a kind of a media-influenced idea of what monsters are at this point in our lives, right? Especially dragons. Disney cartoons, the idea of this approachable dragon exists, of monsters that are maybe kind of cardboard, right? And what Beowulf really gives us is this this deep, scarier monster, right? The one that isn't completely defined. So I really want you to think about what in your mind Grendel looks like, and what Grendel's mother looks like, and what the other dragon looks like. Try to disassociate your previous ideas of what these monsters look like, and think for yourself. Try to find what they are. And notice that the monsters live in 3 archetypal sites of fear throughout this text. The barricaded night house, so this is the hall barricaded up and everyone's in close quarters. The infested underwater current, so underwater and it's infested with all kinds of things. And the reptile-haunted rocks of a wilderness. These are all archetypal, creepy places. Alright, so after you read Beowulf, and I really hope you guys enjoy this one. I love Beowulf. It's just an amazing story, and it's very exciting to read. We're going to have a conversation. So finish reading, actively read Beowulf first. Then I highly suggest also listening to the text. This will really help you understand it. Then I'd like you to answer at least 4 of the questions you see below. When you answer the following questions, try and use examples from the text to support what you're saying, and quote the line number you're referring to so that we can find the passage. When you respond to your peer's post, and you have to do 3, right? Make sure you add to the conversation. So what did their answers make you think further about? How did their answers expand how you thought about something? So here's the questions, and you're choosing 4. Compare the opening funeral with the concluding one. How is each different, and how is it the same? Does your emotional experience of the poem conflict with your understanding of its themes? How does the significance of gold treasure change as the poem progresses? What does it mean to say there are monsters? Discuss the role of monsters in the text. What is the role of art, including poetry, in the poem? Is there a tension between the values of these warrior peoples and the suggested Christianity of the poet? Why do you think that tension is there? And then finally, how would you film a key scene? Go into detail about that one. Alright guys, don't forget that you also this week need to take the quizzes on Beowolf. This will really help you comprehend what you've read, and remember, you can take them over and over again. Next week we're going to be moving on to Chaucer, and we're going to be reading a little bit different kind of Middle Ages type of writing, a little funnier. So please let me know if you have any questions. This is a great text. I know it's difficult, but give yourself the time and you'll really get a lot out of it. I look forward to seeing you guys online.